You wake up, and before your mind has even found its balance, the world rushes in. A screen lights up. Notifications demand attention. Other people's priorities quietly take control of your emotions. And without realizing it, you begin the day already reacting, already chasing, already behind. Most people live like this every morning, not because they are weak, but because they were never taught that the morning is not neutral ground. It is territory, and whoever claims it first decides the direction of the entire day. The Stoics understood something most modern people have forgotten. The morning is not just a time on the clock. It is a psychological gateway. It is the moment when your mind is most open, most impressionable, most honest. Whatever enters that space first shapes the way you think, feel, and act for hours afterward. This is why so many people feel anxious without knowing why, distracted without knowing when it started, exhausted before the day has even asked anything of them. They surrendered their morning without a fight. There is a quiet difference between people who drift through life and people who move with authority. It is not intelligence, it is not luck, it is not talent, it is preparation. The ones who lead their lives do not wake up asking, "What is going to happen to me today?" They wake up asking, "How will I meet whatever comes?" That single shift changes everything. One mindset waits to be shaped by circumstances. The other shapes itself before circumstances arrive. Most people treat the morning like something to get through. They rush. They distract themselves. They numb the silence because silence feels uncomfortable. But discomfort in the morning is not danger. It is opportunity. Silence exposes the truth about who you are before the world tells you who to be. And that truth can be unsettling. It shows you your habits, your excuses, your softness. That is why so many people avoid it. Noise is easier than self-command. The Stoic does the opposite. He does not fear the quiet. He steps into it. He understands that the morning is a small kingdom, and if he does not rule it, someone else will. When you wake up without intention, you borrow your identity from whatever you consume first. News gives you anxiety. Social media gives you comparison. Messages give you urgency. None of these are evil, but none of them are neutral either. They pull your attention outward before you have anchored it inward. And once your attention is scattered, control becomes expensive. This is why the Stoics prepared themselves before the day began. Not with optimism, not with fantasies, but with clarity. They reminded themselves of reality, that people would be difficult, that plans would break, that emotions would rise, and instead of resenting this, they accepted it. Acceptance is not weakness. Acceptance is the foundation of strength. You cannot control a day you refuse to see clearly. When you claim the morning, you are not trying to make the day easy. You are making yourself ready. There is a difference. Easy days do not build strong people. Prepared minds do. The morning is where you decide whether you will spend the rest of the day negotiating with your impulses or commanding them. Every small choice you make before the world wakes up becomes a vote for the person you are becoming. This is why discipline in the morning feels heavy at first. It is not because it is wrong. It is because it is unfamiliar. Comfort has trained you to expect ease. Stoicism trains you to expect responsibility, not responsibility for outcomes, but responsibility for your inner state. That responsibility begins the moment you open your eyes, not an hour later, not after coffee, not after checking messages, immediately. The people who control their lives do not wait to feel ready. They understand that readiness is created through action, not emotion. They rise not because they are inspired, but because rising is aligned with who they choose to be. Identity comes before motivation. Action comes before confidence. And the morning is where this order is either honored or reversed. If you want to change your life, do not start by changing everything. Start by reclaiming the first moments of your day. Not to become perfect, not to become extreme, but to become deliberate. A deliberate morning produces a deliberate mind. A deliberate mind produces deliberate actions. And deliberate actions, repeated daily, produce a life that no longer feels accidental. This is not about becoming better than others. It is about refusing to be weaker than your potential. The Stoics were not chasing greatness. They were avoiding inner collapse. They knew that if the mind is not governed early, it will be governed later by fear, anger, and distraction. The morning was their line of defense. So, before we talk about routines, habits, or techniques, understand this truth. Your morning is not something you survive. It is something you rule or surrender. And once you understand that, the way you wake up will never feel casual again, because you will know that every morning is a quiet decision about the kind of life you are building. Once you understand that the morning is your kingdom, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who is in control when the alarm goes off? Your values or your feelings? This is where most people lose the day before it even begins. They wake up and immediately negotiate with themselves. 5 more minutes, just one scroll, I'll start tomorrow. These thoughts feel harmless, but they are not. They quietly train the mind to obey comfort instead of command. The Stoics saw this clearly. They did not believe that motivation was something to wait for. They believed it was something that followed action. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, not as a king, but as a man reminding his weaker side of the truth. When you struggle to get out of bed, remember that you were born to do the work of a human being, not to hide, not to delay, not to seek comfort at the cost of purpose, to act. Most people misunderstand discipline. They think it is harsh, rigid, or joyless. In reality, discipline is simply self-respect, practiced daily. It is the ability to do what aligns with your values, even when your emotions resist, especially when they resist, because emotions are not leaders, they are signals. And if you let them decide your actions, you will live a reactive life. The first act of discipline in the morning is simple, but it is not easy. You get up when you said you would. No debate, no internal argument. The moment you start negotiating, you teach your mind that your word is flexible. And once your word loses weight with yourself, everything else follows. Confidence weakens, focus fades, trust in yourself erodes quietly. The Stoic understood that the body must be trained to obey the mind before the mind can remain steady under pressure. This is why the morning matters so much. It is the only time of day when you face resistance without external pressure. No one is watching. No one is forcing you. That is what makes it powerful. When you rise anyway, you prove something to yourself that no compliment can replace. You prove that your identity is stronger than your impulse. Discipline in the morning is not about doing everything perfectly. It is about refusing to start the day in retreat. Hitting snooze is not about sleep. It is about avoidance. Reaching for the phone is not about information. It is about distraction. These habits are small, but they shape the direction of your will. And the will, once weakened early, struggles to recover later. This is why Stoicism is not soft philosophy. It is practical. It does not ask how you feel. It asks what must be done. When you act in alignment with that question, something shifts internally. Your mood may still fluctuate, but your direction becomes stable. You stop waiting to feel ready and start becoming ready through movement. Over time, this changes the relationship you have with yourself. You begin to trust your own decisions. You begin to move through the day with quiet authority. Not because everything goes your way, but because you no longer abandon yourself at the first sign of discomfort. That is strength. Not loud strength, not visible strength, internal strength. The people who appear calm under pressure are not born that way. They trained it. And most of that training happened in moments no one saw. In early mornings, in small decisions, in choosing action over comfort when it would have been easy to delay. If you want your life to feel less chaotic, start by removing chaos from the first minutes of your day. Rise when you say you will. Move your body out of bed immediately. Speak a simple command to yourself, not a motivational speech, just a signal. We move now. This is not about forcing energy. It is about creating momentum. Momentum carries you when motivation disappears. Discipline is not punishment, it is protection. It protects you from the version of yourself that wants ease at the cost of growth. And the morning is where that protection is either applied or ignored. Every day you practice this, your mind becomes less fragile. Your resolve becomes quieter, but stronger. You stop needing external pressure to do what you know is right. This is how control begins, not by mastering the world, but by mastering the first decision of the day. When you win that moment, the rest of the day meets a different version of you, one that does not wait, one that does not negotiate, one that moves forward even when it would rather stay comfortable. And once discipline replaces desire as your guide, the morning no longer feels like a struggle. It feels like alignment, like stepping into who you said you were going to be. After discipline gets you out of bed, the next battle is quieter but far more dangerous. It is the battle for your attention. Most people lose it instantly. Before their feet touch the ground, they open a screen, messages, news, social media. Other people's emotions, opinions, and problems rush into their mind before their own thoughts have even formed. And just like that, their inner world is no longer theirs. The Stoics understood that whoever controls your attention controls your behavior. This is why silence was not an accident in their lives. It was a deliberate practice. Epictetus warned that if you want to improve, you must accept appearing out of sync with the world. Silence in the morning can feel strange at first, unproductive, even uncomfortable. But that discomfort is not a sign of emptiness. It is a sign that your mind is no longer being fed noise. The morning mind is soft, open. Whatever you allow in first becomes the reference point for everything that follows. If the first thing you consume is chaos, urgency, or comparison, you will carry that tone all day. You may not notice it consciously, but it will show up in your impatience, your anxiety, and your lack of focus. Silence interrupts this pattern. It creates a gap between stimulus and response, and that gap is where freedom lives. Silence does not mean doing nothing. It means choosing not to react before you are ready. When you sit in silence after waking, even for a few minutes, something important happens. You begin to hear yourself again. Not the dramatic voice, not the fearful one, the honest one. You notice what you are actually feeling beneath the surface. Tension, anticipation, resistance, calm. Instead of being carried away by these states, you observe them, and observation weakens their control. This is why the Stoics valued stillness. They knew that a mind constantly reacting cannot think clearly. Silence gives you perspective. It reminds you that thoughts are events, not commands. Emotions are signals, not rulers. When you rush into the world immediately, you confuse urgency with importance. Everything feels equally demanding. Silence restores hierarchy. It helps you remember what actually matters. Most people fear silence because it removes distraction, and distraction has become their coping mechanism. Without noise, unresolved thoughts surface, unfinished emotions appear. But the Stoic does not run from this. He meets it calmly, because he knows that anything avoided in silence will eventually return in chaos later in the day. This is where true control begins, not by controlling the outside world, but by choosing when and how it enters you. When you delay external input, even briefly, you are telling your nervous system that you are safe, that you are not being chased, that you are not behind. This calms the body, and a calm body allows a clear mind. You do not need an hour of meditation. You do not need perfect stillness. You need intention. Sit up, breathe slowly, let the mind settle without trying to fix it. Ask one simple question, not 10. What kind of energy will I carry today? Do not force an answer. Let it arrive. Silence creates space for clarity to emerge naturally. Over time, this practice changes how you move through the world. You become less reactive, less provoked, less scattered. When challenges arise later in the day, they feel familiar, not overwhelming. You already met yourself in the morning. You are not meeting your emotions for the first time under pressure. This is why silence is not weakness. It is preparation. It is how you reclaim authorship over your mental state. The world will still be loud. People will still demand attention, but you will not be meeting them from a place of inner noise. You will meet them grounded. When discipline gets you up, silence gets you centered, and a centered mind does not get pulled apart easily. This is the moment where the day stops controlling you, and you begin to move through it deliberately, not defensively. Once you rise with discipline and ground yourself in silence, the next step is not optimism, it is realism. Most people believe that a good day is one where nothing goes wrong. The Stoic knows better. A good day is one where nothing unexpected destroys your inner balance. And that balance is built before the day begins, not in the middle of the storm. Life does not wait for you to feel ready. People will interrupt you, plans will collapse, words will be misunderstood, energy will dip. If you walk into the day assuming things will go smoothly, you are fragile by design. The Stoics refused to live this way. They practiced facing difficulty in advance, not to suffer twice, but to suffer less when it arrived. This practice is simple, but it requires honesty. In the quiet of the morning, you calmly imagine what could challenge you today. Not catastrophes, just reality. Someone may test your patience. Something may waste your time. An emotion may rise that usually controls you. Instead of hoping these moments do not happen, you ask a better question. How will I respond when they do? This is not negative thinking. It is strategic thinking. By anticipating friction, you remove its power to shock you. When the moment arrives, your nervous system recognizes it. You are not surprised, you are prepared, and preparation transforms reaction into response. Most emotional outbursts happen because people feel ambushed by life. They are caught off guard. They take things personally because they expected ease. The Stoic expects resistance, and because of that, he does not interpret difficulty as injustice. He interprets it as training. When you rehearse challenges mentally, you are building emotional muscle. You are deciding in advance that impatience will not decide for you, that frustration will not lead, that exhaustion will not excuse you. This does not make you rigid, it makes you resilient. Flexibility is only possible when you are not panicking. There is a quiet confidence that comes from this practice. You walk into the day knowing that nothing will be perfect, and that you do not need it to be. You have already met the worst parts of the day in your mind, calmly, without drama. So when they appear in real life, they feel smaller, manageable, familiar. This is how the Stoic stays steady while others unravel. Not because he is emotionless, but because he has already accepted reality. Acceptance removes resistance, and resistance is what turns inconvenience into suffering. You do not need to imagine every possible problem. One or two is enough. Identify the area where you usually lose control, your temper, your focus, your confidence. Then visualize yourself handling that moment with composure, not perfectly, intentionally. This creates a blueprint, and the mind follows blueprints far more easily than it follows wishes. Facing the day before it starts does something deeper as well. It removes fear. Fear thrives in uncertainty. When you look directly at what might challenge you, uncertainty shrinks. You stop dreading vague possibilities and start dealing with clear scenarios. This alone can change how heavy life feels. When you stop demanding that the day be easy, you stop being disappointed when it is not. And in that shift, strength appears. Quiet strength, the kind that does not need to announce itself. This is the moment where Stoicism becomes lived experience, not theory. You are no longer reacting blindly. You are stepping into the day already awake, already centered, already prepared. And from that place, very little can shake you. After you wake with discipline, protect silence, and face the day before it begins, there is one more layer that separates ordinary mornings from powerful ones. You must anchor your mind, because if you do not decide who you are early, The world will decide for you later. Most people wake up mentally undefined. Their identity is loose. Their values are foggy. Their direction is unclear. So when emails arrive, when criticism appears, when pressure hits, they bend. Not because they are weak, but because they never planted their feet. The Stoic does not allow this. He begins the day by reminding himself who he is, how he chooses to live, and what truly matters. Marcus Aurelius did not write meditations for the public. He wrote it for himself. Every morning and night, he returned to the same truths. Not because he forgot them intellectually, but because life constantly tries to pull you away from them emotionally. This is why anchoring the mind is not optional. It is defensive. It protects your inner order from external chaos. An anchor is not a long speech. It is a single truth you return to every day, a sentence that defines how you move through the world. When repeated daily, it becomes part of your nervous system, part of your identity. It grounds you before distraction has a chance to destabilize you. An anchor sounds like this: I do not control what happens today, only how I respond. Or this: my worth does not depend on approval. Or this: I choose discipline over comfort. These are not motivational quotes. They are operating principles. They tell your mind where to stand. When the day challenges you, your anchor is what you fall back on. When someone disrespects you, you remember who you decided to be this morning. When plans fall apart, you return to your chosen principle instead of spiraling emotionally. This is how calm is sustained, not by willpower alone, but by structure. Without an anchor, your mind drifts. It reacts. It negotiates with fear. With an anchor, your mind has a home base, a place of return, and every return strengthens it. This practice also eliminates decision fatigue. You do not need to constantly ask how you should behave. You already decided. Your anchor answers for you. That is why disciplined people appear confident. They are not improvising their character throughout the day. Choose one truth, not 10. One, something simple, honest, and non-negotiable. Repeat it slowly in the morning. Let it settle. Then move into the day carrying it with you. You will notice something subtle but powerful. Fewer emotional swings, faster recovery from stress, clearer boundaries. The world is loud. Opinions are endless. Expectations are heavy. If you do not anchor yourself early, you will be pulled in every direction. But when your mind is anchored, you move through noise without absorbing it. This is not detachment from life. It is alignment with yourself. And alignment creates strength that does not fade by noon. After anchoring the mind, the Stoic turns to the body, not for vanity, not for appearance, but for command. Because the body is the first thing the mind must lead each day. If the body is weak, sluggish, and indulgent, the mind will follow. If the body is alert, disciplined, and awake, the mind rises with it. The Stoics never separated the body from the soul. They understood that character is trained through action, not thought alone. Marcus Aurelius challenged himself with a simple but brutal question each morning: are you made for comfort or for purpose? He knew that staying in bed was not rest, it was avoidance, and avoidance, repeated daily, erodes self-respect. Movement in the morning is not about intensity, it is about obedience. You tell the body to move, and it moves. That single act sends a powerful message inward. I am in charge. I do not wait for comfort. I do not negotiate with resistance. I act. Most people move only when they feel motivated. The Stoic moves because it is right. And that difference changes everything. When you move your body early, you break the spell of softness before it takes hold. Blood begins to circulate. Breath deepens. The fog lifts. The nervous system wakes up with clarity instead of anxiety. This is why even 10 minutes is enough. Push-ups, stretching, a walk in silence, cold water on the face, a brief cold shower. These are not fitness routines. They are rituals of command. Each one says the same thing. I choose discipline over comfort. I choose strength over ease. Epictetus taught that mastery over the body trains mastery over desire. When you teach yourself to do something uncomfortable on purpose, you weaken the voice that says, later. You train your will, and a trained will does not collapse when the day becomes difficult. Notice how different your posture feels after movement, how your thoughts sharpen, how excuses quiet down. This is not coincidence, this is alignment, the body and mind working together instead of fighting each other. People who skip this step often feel mentally scattered all day. They search for focus, for motivation, for confidence. But the Stoic knows confidence is built physically before it is felt emotionally. You earn it through action. You do not need perfect form. You do not need perfect energy. You only need consistency. When movement becomes part of your morning identity, you stop asking whether you feel ready. You simply begin. And beginning is where power lives. By the time others are still waking up, you have already overcome resistance. You have already led yourself, and that quiet victory follows you everywhere.